My husband asked me to kick out my dying son and said he was a burden. When my son was diagnosed with leukemia at 24, everything in our lives shifted overnight. He had been living on his own, working and building his future, but the treatments were brutal and he was too weak to manage alone. So he moved back into the house that had always been his safety net, the house his late father left to both of us. My son was now named Ethan, and my new husband was named Mark. And from the very beginning, Mark made it clear that Ethan's presence felt like an intrusion to him. He complained that this was not what he signed up for, that marrying me was supposed to mean a fresh chapter, not caring for an adult child who was sick. And every word he said carried this edge that made the house feel colder. Mark constantly reminded me that Ethan was grown and should handle his own problems. He said that adults were supposed to be independent and that illness did not excuse dependence. He would sigh loudly whenever Ethan walked into the room, or mutter under his breath about how cramped the house felt now, even though nothing about the space had changed except the tension in the air. I tried to explain that this was temporary, that Ethan was fighting for his life, but Mark brushed it off and said he was not running a care facility, and those words settled into my chest like stones. The way Mark treated Ethan quickly turned from cold to deliberately cruel. He would cook dinner for just the two of us and leave nothing for Ethan, then shrug and say there was not enough food. When Ethan was too nauseated and weak from chemotherapy to make himself something, Mark would say that I was not his servant and that Ethan had hands that still worked. Early in the mornings, Mark blasted loud music, knowing Ethan was dealing with constant nausea and exhaustion. When I begged him to lower the volume, he said he refused to change his routine just because an adult could not handle real life. The worst moments came after treatments. When Ethan was visibly sick and struggling, Mark complained about medical equipment being around the house as if it were trash cluttering his space. When Ethan threw up from the chemotherapy, Mark made exaggerated gagging noises and complained about the smell. He even sprayed air freshener directly toward Ethan and said it ruined his appetite. Watching my son shrink into himself during those moments broke something in me, but at the time, I still believed marriage meant compromise and patience. When Ethan lost his hair, Mark crossed another line. He bought a cheap hat with a cruel phrase printed across it and left it on Ethan's bed. When I confronted him, he laughed and said it was just a joke and someone needed to keep the mood light. I realized then that he did not see my son as a human being in pain. He saw him as an inconvenience. Not long after that, Mark started talking about rent. He said living for free did not teach responsibility. When I reminded him that Ethan could not work while fighting cancer, Mark said plenty of sick people still contributed and accused Ethan of using his illness as an excuse to be lazy. Mark left apartment listings on Ethan's bed and taped job ads to his door. He talked endlessly about other people's successful children and how some kids were achievers while others expected handouts. Every word felt designed to grind Ethan down piece by piece. The breaking point came when Ethan's white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, and the doctors warned us that even minor infections could be deadly. Despite this, Mark invited his friends over for poker night. 6 men crowded into the house, smoking and coughing everywhere. When I begged him to cancel, he said it was his house too and he would not stop living because my son had a weak immune system. Ethan ended up hospitalized with a serious infection that nearly killed him. Sitting beside his bed while machines beeped and doctors rushed around was the most terrifying experience of my life. And even then, Mark found a way to be cruel. He told me this was a sign that maybe it was time to consider long-term care. He brought me brochures for nursing homes and said trained professionals would handle it better. That was the moment something clicked in my mind, something I had not fully confronted before. The house was not just mine through marriage or convenience. It had been willed specifically to me and Ethan by his late father. Mark was never added to the deed, because I had promised my first husband that our son would always have a home. I called my brother-in-law David, a real estate attorney, and asked him to pull the paperwork. He confirmed what I already knew but had not acted on. Ethan legally owned half the house. Mark had no claim at all. When Ethan was discharged from the hospital, Mark greeted him with more apartment listings, talking about disability assistance and affordable housing as if he were doing him a favor. That was when I told Mark to pack his things. He laughed at first and accused me of choosing my freeloading son over my husband. I showed him the deed and told him the truth, that the house belonged to me and Ethan, and that he was the one living there by permission only. Mark's face turned red and he started shouting about his rights as a husband. David arrived with evictionpapers.com and Professional, explaining that Mark had no legal standing, no rental agreement, no ownership. Mark tried to argue, listing groceries he bought and a garage repair he once did. Ethan finally spoke up, his voice weak but steady, telling Mark to go straight to hell. Hearing my gentle son speak with that kind of clarity made my heart ache and swell at the same time. Mark packed in angry silence, slamming doors and muttering insults as he went. When the house finally grew quiet, Ethan's body started shaking, all the adrenaline crashing down at once. I held his hands and felt how cold and fragile they were. David stayed with us, ordered food, and made plans to ensure Mark would leave without incident. That night, despite the noise of Mark packing, I slept better than I had in months. Every sound meant we were closer to peace. The next morning, Mark tried to backtrack, talking about counseling and mistakes, reaching for my hand. I pulled away and told him it was too late, that deliberately endangering my son was not something therapy could fix. Ethan told him calmly that he was done being treated like a burden in his own home. Mark's sadness flipped to anger in seconds, but he left again when David arrived. The following days were tense, but different, because for the first time the tension had an end date. To protect Ethan during his next treatment, I arranged for a home health nurse named Laura to stay with him while I took him to the clinic. She was firm and no nonsense, and Mark backed down in her presence. The appointment itself brought unexpected relief. Ethan's doctor talked about how emotional stability impacted recovery, and how removing stress could help his body respond to treatment. Those words stayed with me, because they confirmed what I already felt in my bones. When we returned home and saw Mark's truck gone, something lifted inside me. Laura told me she stopped him from taking things that were not his, and agreed to come regularly to help with Ethan's care. That night, Ethan laughed watching a movie in the living room, medical equipment out in the open, no complaints, no cruelty, just quiet peace. And in that moment I knew this house was finally becoming what it was meant to be again. The days after Mark left the house unfolded slowly. Like our lives were cautiously testing a new rhythm. Ethan spent most of his time resting, his body still recovering from the infection and the treatments that followed. But the difference in the house was immediate. There was no loud music jolting him awake, no muttered insults when medical supplies were visible, no sharp comments hanging in the air waiting to land. The silence was not empty, it was calm. And that calm settled over both of us like a protective blanket we had been missing for far too long. Laura returned 2 days later for her first official visit. She checked Ethan's vitals carefully, spoke to him directly instead of over him, and explained everything she was doing in a way that gave him control over his own body again. She commented that his tension seemed lower, that his breathing was steadier. I told her about Mark moving out and the change in the house, and she nodded like this was not new information to her. She said she had seen many patients struggle not just with illness but with toxic environments, and removing one could make a real difference. That evening, Ethan managed to eat a full bowl of soup and half a sandwich, which might not sound like much to anyone else, but to me it felt like a victory. We sat at the kitchen table together. No rushing, no criticism, just quiet conversation about nothing important. The weather, a show he wanted to watch, a memory from college. I realized how long it had been since we talked like that without fear of being overheard. The house felt like it was slowly exhaling after holding its breath for months. Mark did not disappear quietly. My phone started lighting up with messages that swung wildly between apology and accusation. He blamed stress. He blamed fear. He blamed me. Then he begged. Then he raged. Each message was another attempt to pull me back into the chaos. After the fifth one, I blocked his number. The sudden silence that followed felt like a door closing. Firm and final. I did not feel guilt, only relief. Because every message had been about him and never about the harm he caused Ethan. David checked in regularly, not just as a lawyer but as family. He reminded me to document everything, the texts, the comments, the behavior, just in case Mark tried to escalate things. He also reassured me that legally we were secure, that the house was protected, and that Ethan's ownership was clear and unquestionable. Hearing that confirmed again helped me sleep at night, knowing no one could threaten our stability anymore. A few days later, Ethan's friend Chloe came by. She had tried to visit earlier during his illness but admitted Mark made her feel unwelcome. She brought board games and snacks and treated Ethan like the same person he had always been. Not fragile, not pitied, just Ethan. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, listening to their laughter drift through the house, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Hearing my son laugh without restraint reminded me that joy was still possible even in the middle of treatment. After Chloe left, Ethan told me he felt more like himself than he had in months. That not having to brace for cruelty made everything easier, including the pain. Those words stayed with me because they confirmed that protecting him was not just about physical safety. It was about giving him the space to heal emotionally. Something Mark had actively denied him. I told Ethan he never had to apologize for needing care, that this house existed for him just as much as it did for me. The next chemotherapy session was harder physically, but emotionally different. The house welcomed us back instead of punishing us. I dimmed the lights, played soft music, brought water and crackers without anyone commenting or mocking. There were no gagging noises, no complaints about smell or mess, just care. I sat beside him through the worst of the nausea, holding his hand. And even though it was exhausting, it felt clean, like this was how it was always supposed to be. At the follow-up appointment, Dr. Harris reviewed Ethan's blood work carefully. She told us his white cell count was slowly improving, still fragile but moving in the right direction. She asked about stress levels at home. And when I explained the changes, she nodded and said something that surprised me. She said emotional safety could impact treatment response more than people realized. That constant stress weakened the immune system, and removing it could help the body fight back. Hearing a medical professional validate what I felt instinctively made me tear up right there in the office. Outside the clinic, we ran into her husband Ben, a social worker who specialized in family support during long-term illness. He asked gently how we were coping and mentioned caregiver support groups. I admitted I had not thought about my own support much. Ben gave me information about a weekly group and encouraged me to consider it. He said caregivers often burned out quietly while focusing entirely on the patient. I thanked him and tucked the information into my bag. Not sure yet if I was ready but grateful someone saw me too. When we returned home that afternoon, Mark's absence felt permanent in a way it had not before. His things were gone, his presence erased. The house felt brighter somehow, even though nothing physical had changed. Laura stopped by later and helped clean Ethan's port site. She remarked again on how calm he seemed, how his answers were clearer and his eyes more focused. She said mental relief often showed up physically before people expected it to. That night, I sat alone in the living room after Ethan went to bed and realized something else had changed. My body felt different. The constant tension headache I had been living with was gone. My shoulders were not locked up near my ears. I could breathe deeply without that tight feeling in my chest. I had been so focused on Ethan's suffering that I had ignored how much damage Mark's behavior had been doing to me as well. Recognizing that made me angry for a moment, then determined to never allow that kind of harm again. Over the next week, we slowly rebuilt routines. Mornings were quiet, afternoons were for rest, evenings were for something gentle, a card game, a movie, conversation. Chloe came back again, this time staying longer. She cooked dinner without being asked and cleaned up afterward. Her presence felt supportive instead of invasive, and I noticed how much. Ethan's mood lifted when friends treated him normally instead of like a problem. To manage, Mark tried reaching out through his brother, claiming he wanted to talk. David shut it down firmly, telling him any communication needed to go through legal channels. When I heard that, I felt another layer of protection settle into place. The chaos was being contained, and that containment gave us room to heal. I no longer jumped at every sound outside. No longer checked my phone with dread. Peace was becoming familiar instead of foreign. One evening, Ethan told me he had been feeling guilty, that maybe he was the reason my marriage fell apart. I turned off the television and looked at him directly, telling him clearly that none of this was his fault. That illness did not cause cruelty, and that Mark's choices were his own. I told Ethan I would choose him again without hesitation, no matter the circumstances. He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes, and said he was starting to believe me. A few days later, I attended my first caregiver support meeting, sitting in a circle of strangers who somehow understood my life better than most people I knew. Parents talked about impossible choices, about partners who could not cope, about having to protect their children even when it meant losing a relationship. When it was my turn, I shared what happened with Mark. The room stayed quiet, not judgmental, just attentive. One woman told me afterward that I did the right thing, that protecting your child was never the wrong decision. I walked out of that room feeling lighter than I had in a long time. At home, Ethan rested while I made dinner, the house filled with a gentle warmth instead of tension. We were still in the middle of a long battle. Cancer had not disappeared. Treatments were still ongoing, but the war inside our own walls was over, and that made all the difference. As I watched my son sleep peacefully that night, I knew we were moving forward, not just surviving, but slowly rebuilding something stronger than what we lost. The following weeks settled into a fragile but hopeful pattern. Ethan continued treatment, and although his body still struggled, his spirit was no longer under constant attack. The house began to feel like a place of recovery instead of survival. Sunlight through the windows felt warmer. The rooms no longer carried the weight of anticipation and fear. Even simple sounds like the kettle boiling or the floor creaking at night no longer made either of us tense. It was as if the walls themselves were learning how to be kind again. Laura increased her visits to 3 times a week. She helped manage Ethan's medications, monitored his port carefully, and taught me how to spot early signs of infection. But more than that, she treated Ethan with dignity. She spoke to him like an adult whose life mattered beyond his diagnosis. She asked about his interests, his plans, his memories, and I could see how much that mattered to him. Illness had taken so much control from his life, and Laura quietly gave pieces of it back. Chloe became a steady presence as well. She started coming over twice a week, sometimes just to sit and watch shows with Ethan, other times bringing groceries or cooking meals that Ethan could tolerate. She never made him feel like a project or a responsibility. She laughed with him, teased him, argued about game rules, and treated him like the same friend she always knew. I noticed how her presence pulled Ethan back toward the world instead of further into isolation. One afternoon while Ethan was napping, Chloe asked if she could talk to me privately. She explained that her apartment lease was ending soon and wondered if she could rent our spare room. She said she wanted to help with bills, help with Ethan when needed, and be around in case I needed support. The suggestion caught me off guard, but as she spoke, I realized how thoughtful it was. She was not asking to be saved. She was offering to contribute. I told her I needed to talk to Ethan since he owned the house with me, and she said she understood completely. When I brought it up later that evening, Ethan surprised me by smiling. He said having Chloe around made the house feel normal again, less like a hospital and more like a home. We talked through boundaries, quiet hours, and expectations, and for the first time in months the conversation felt like planning a future instead of managing a crisis. The next day I called Chloe and told her yes. Her excitement was quiet but genuine, respectful of what we were dealing with. Around that same time, Mark tried a new angle. Instead of contacting me directly, he reached out to Ethan through email. The messages were carefully worded, full of self-pity and subtle blame. He talked about stress, misunderstanding, and family loyalty. He asked Ethan to convince me to reconsider, implying that Ethan owed him something. Ethan showed me the messages immediately, his hands shaking not from fear but from anger. He blocked Mark without replying and thanked me for teaching him that he did not owe cruelty his silence. David later told me Mark had contacted him asking if there was any way to challenge the eviction or claim marital rights to the house. David shut it down firmly, explaining again that Mark had no legal standing, no ownership, and no leverage. Apparently Mark was shocked that marriage did not automatically grant him control. Hearing that only reinforced how entitled he had always been, how deeply he believed other people existed to serve his comfort. As the emotional noise faded, new concerns surfaced: finances, medical bills, prescriptions, transportation, the practical weight of long-term illness. Ben called to check in and asked gently how we were managing. When I admitted I was worried, he walked me through a hospital assistance program and helped submit the paperwork. Days later, he called back to tell us we were approved. A significant portion of Ethan's medication costs would be covered. I cried after hanging up, not from sadness but relief. Kindness from strangers felt overwhelming after so much hostility. The caregiver support group became a weekly anchor for me. Listening to others share their fears and decisions helped me process my own. Several people talked about choosing their children over partners who could not cope. Their stories mirrored mine in painful but validating ways. One woman told me her daughter was now in remission and she believed removing toxic stress had saved her life. Those words stayed with me, because deep down I believed the same about Ethan. At home, our routines deepened. Mornings started with quiet coffee together when Ethan felt well enough. Afternoons were for rest and gentle activity. Evenings were for connection, card games, movies, sometimes just sitting in silence. The peace allowed Ethan's body to recover more effectively. His appetite improved slightly. His sleep became deeper. and even Laura commented on the change, saying his engagement and responsiveness were noticeably better. One evening, Ethan admitted he had forgotten what it felt like to relax in his own home, to not feel like a burden or an inconvenience. Hearing that filled me with a mix of grief and resolve. Grief for what he endured, and resolve to ensure he never felt that way again. I told him this house existed for him just as much as it did for me, and that his right to safety and dignity was non-negotiable. Chloe officially moved in a few weeks later. She brought plants, books, and a calm energy that blended seamlessly into our lives. She asked about quiet times, cleaning routines, and how best to support Ethan without overwhelming him. Her respect contrasted sharply with Mark's entitlement, and I realized how wrong I had been to confuse control with partnership in the past. Real support did not demand space, it made space. Ethan had another oncology appointment soon after. Dr. Harris reviewed his latest tests and smiled cautiously. His numbers were improving steadily. Not dramatically, but consistently. She explained that his body was responding well to the treatment plan. She also emphasized again how important emotional stability was for immune response. She said, patients who felt safe and supported often tolerated treatment better. I did not mention Mark by name, but we both understood what had changed. After the appointment, Ethan asked if we could take a short walk before heading home. It was a small thing, just around the block, but it felt monumental. He moved slowly, leaning on my arm, but he did not need to stop. The fresh air and sunlight seemed to energize him, and when we reached the house again, he said he felt proud of himself. I told him I was proud too, of his strength, his honesty, and his courage. That night as I lay in bed, I realized something else had shifted. I was no longer afraid of the future. I did not know what it would bring, but I was no longer bracing for cruelty. The fear that once dominated my thoughts had loosened its grip, replaced by cautious hope and determination. Whatever came next, we would face it together, without someone tearing us down from inside our own walls. The next few weeks were not easy. Ethan had good days and bad days. Nausea, fatigue, and pain still visited, but they were met with care instead of contempt. Chloe helped when she could. Laura continued her visits, and I learned how to pace myself instead of running on empty. We were building something sustainable, not perfect, but honest and supportive. One afternoon David came by for dinner. He commented on how different the house felt, how Ethan looked stronger and how I seemed lighter. He said helping remove Mark from our lives was one of the most meaningful things he had done professionally, not because it was dramatic, but because it protected someone vulnerable. Hearing that reminded me that standing up for Ethan had been the right choice, even when it felt terrifying. As the evening wound down, Ethan sat quietly on the couch, watching Chloe and David talk. He looked peaceful, not guarded or withdrawn, just present. And in that moment I understood that healing was not just about medicine or numbers on a chart. It was about reclaiming safety, dignity, and connection, the things Mark had tried to strip away. And as we moved forward, I knew the hardest part was behind us. The fight was no longer inside our home, and that gave us the strength to face everything else together. The season shifted quietly outside our windows, warmer afternoons and longer evenings, and with it came changes that felt both subtle and profound. Ethan's treatments continued, still demanding and draining, but his recovery between sessions improved in ways that surprised even his care team. Laura noted how his vitals stabilized faster after chemo days, how his body seemed to rebound with more resilience, and she reminded us again that healing was never just physical, that safety and peace were powerful medicine too. Chloe settled fully into the rhythm of the house. She respected Ethan's limits without making him feel fragile. If he needed quiet, she kept the space calm. If he felt energetic, she matched his mood with laughter and conversation. She helped with rides to appointments when I needed rest, cooked meals that fit Ethan's nausea patterns, and somehow managed to make the house feel fuller without being overwhelming. I realized how much difference the right presence made compared to the wrong one. I finally turned my attention to the financial aftermath Mark left behind. Sitting at the kitchen table late one night with statements spread out in front of me, I discovered credit card balances I did not recognize, charges from bars, restaurants, and stores Ethan and I never stepped foot in, all while Mark complained relentlessly about money and accused my son of being a burden. The anger that rose in me was sharp and clarifying. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor named Linda who specialized in separation cases. Linda reviewed everything carefully, explaining my options in calm, practical terms. She helped me begin separating accounts, closing joint cards, and protecting my credit. She confirmed again that Mark had no claim to the house, no equity, no financial leverage. Hearing it stated so clearly felt grounding, like I was reclaiming control, piece by piece. She advised me to wait before filing for divorce until Ethan's health stabilized further. Not out of fear but wisdom, I took her advice seriously. Around this time, Mark's presence faded almost completely. Neighbors mentioned they had not seen his car in weeks, and I realized I was no longer watching the street or bracing at every sound. The constant vigilance had dissolved without me noticing. One quiet afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about him. That realization felt like freedom. Ethan's next round of blood work brought cautiously optimistic news. Dr. Harris explained that his markers were moving in the right direction. Not a finish line, but progress. She used words like response and trajectory, careful not to promise anything, but the hope in her voice was unmistakable. She pulled me aside afterward and said she had seen patients turn corners when their environments became supportive instead of hostile. She did not need details to understand what had changed. Ben checked in again and asked how Ethan was coping emotionally. I mentioned that while things were better, guilt still surfaced sometimes. Ben suggested a young adult cancer support group that met twice a month nearby, facilitated by a social worker who focused on life beyond treatment. I brought the idea to Ethan gently, expecting resistance. But after a few days, he surprised me by asking if I could drive him to the next meeting. His willingness to try felt like another small victory. The night of the meeting, I waited in the parking lot, giving him privacy while staying close. When he came out after more than an hour, his expression was different, lighter. On the drive home, he talked about the people he met, others his age who understood the strange limbo of being young and seriously ill. Some were finished with treatment and rebuilding their lives. Others were still in the thick of it, like him. Hearing their stories gave him something no scan or lab result ever could. Proof that life continued. He started attending regularly, and each time he returned with more energy, more curiosity about the future. He talked about finishing school someday, about traveling, about normal things he had put on hold. I listened carefully, letting him lead, because hope needed space to breathe without pressure. I could see how these connections fed his spirit in ways medicine alone could not. One afternoon, Travis from next door mentioned casually that Mark had driven past the house a few weeks earlier but had not stopped. I thanked him for letting me know and called the NAN emergency line just to create a record. The officer took the information calmly and advised me to call if it escalated. Knowing there was a paper trail made me feel safer, but thankfully nothing came of it. Mark seemed to finally be retreating from our lives. My own body continued to recover as well. Headaches that once felt constant disappeared. My sleep deepened, and I realized how much stress I had normalized while living with Mark. Caring for Ethan had been hard enough without carrying someone else's cruelty. Now that weight was gone, I could show up fully without breaking myself in the process. The guilt I once felt for choosing my son faded into certainty. Chloe and I talked one evening while Ethan rested. She told me how hard it had been to watch Mark treat Ethan the way he did. How unwelcome she felt the one time she visited before. Her honesty stung but also validated what I had seen. She said the house felt safe now, and that safety mattered more than anything else. Hearing that from someone outside our immediate family reinforced that we had not imagined the harm. It had been real. As weeks passed, Ethan's good days began to outnumber the bad. Not by a wide margin, but enough to notice. We took longer walks, sat outside in the evenings, talked about planting a small garden when spring came. Nothing extravagant, just something to look forward to. Those conversations were careful but hopeful, grounded in reality yet no longer dominated by fear. I met with a divorce attorney quietly one morning while Ethan was at an appointment with Laura. The consultation was straightforward. The attorney explained the process, the timeline, and what to expect. She reviewed the documentation of Mark's behavior and said it worked strongly in my favor should he try anything. She used the phrase pattern of conduct, and hearing his cruelty described in legal terms instead of emotional ones was strangely empowering. I left knowing there was a clear path forward whenever I was ready. That evening I told Ethan I had taken that step, not to burden him but to be honest. He listened quietly, and then said he was proud of me. That meant more than anything else he could have said. His approval was not something I needed, but hearing it affirmed that we were aligned, facing the future together instead of being pulled in opposite directions. The caregiver support group continued to be a steady anchor. One week a father talked about regretting not protecting his child sooner from a resentful partner. Another parent shared how removing negativity transformed their household. Each story layered over mine, reinforcing that choosing compassion over comfort was never the wrong decision. I began to see my story not as a failure of marriage but as an act of protection. One particularly warm evening we sat on the porch together, Ethan wrapped in a blanket, Chloe nearby reading, the sky shifting colors as the sun set. Ethan turned to me and thanked me again for choosing him. I told him there was never a choice to weigh. That love made it obvious. We sat in comfortable silence after that. No need to fill it with reassurance or explanation. As his next appointment approached, Dr. Harris adjusted his treatment plan slightly based on how well he was responding. She explained the changes carefully and answered all our questions. She spoke cautiously about the future, using words like remission as possibilities rather than promises. But for the first time those words felt reachable, not distant or abstract. Driving home that day, I realized how far we had come from the fear-filled nights in the hospital, from the cruelty inside our own walls. The journey ahead was still long, but the ground beneath our feet felt solid now. Our home was no longer a battlefield, it was a refuge, and that made all the difference as we continued forward together. The final stretch of that year arrived quietly, not with a single dramatic moment but with a series of small confirmations that life was moving forward. Ethan continued his treatment schedule, still tiring and uncomfortable, but his body handled it with a strength that felt new. Dr. Harris reviewed his results one afternoon and smiled in that careful professional way that doctors do when they want to offer hope without recklessness. She said the word remission as a possibility, not a guarantee, but hearing it spoken out loud changed the air in the room. It turned the future from something we feared into something we could imagine again. Ethan took that hope seriously but gently. He did not rush ahead or make grand promises to himself. Instead, he focused on what he could do that day, attending his young adult support group regularly, taking short walks when his energy allowed, keeping up with small routines that reminded him he was still himself, not just a patient. Chloe supported him in ways that never felt heavy-handed. She celebrated his good days without pressure and sat quietly with him on the hard ones. Her presence had become woven into the fabric of our home. One evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan mentioned that he wanted to finish his degree someday, maybe not immediately, but when his health allowed. The way he said it was calm and grounded, not desperate or wishful, just matter of fact. I told him that sounded like a good plan and that we would figure it out together when the time came. The conversation felt normal in the best possible way, like a mother and son talking about the future instead of fighting for survival. A few weeks later, Dr. Harris confirmed what we had been cautiously hoping for. Ethan's latest scans showed significant improvement. The cancer markers were continuing to drop and his bone marrow results looked better than expected. She was clear that treatment would continue and monitoring would be ongoing. But she said his response was strong and encouraging. She credited his age and resilience. But she also emphasized again how important emotional safety had been to his progress. Stress weakens the immune system and peace allows the body to fight back. Hearing that from her felt like validation carved in stone. That night we celebrated quietly. Takeout from Ethan's favorite place. Real plates on the table. Candles just because we could. Chloe raised her glass of soda and toasted to progress. Not victory, just progress, which felt more honest and more sustainable. Ethan laughed more easily that night, and the sound filled the house in a way that still caught me off guard sometimes. Joy had returned gradually, but now it felt like it was here to stay. With Ethan's health stabilizing, I finally moved forward with the divorce. The paperwork felt strangely unemotional. Just forms and signatures and dates. My attorney handled everything efficiently. Mark never contested it, never showed up, never tried to argue. It was as if he had simply drifted out of our lives. The judge signed the decree in a brief hearing that lasted only minutes. And when it was over, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant, just free. That evening we marked the occasion simply. Dinner together. No speeches, no dramatic declarations. Ethan thanked me for choosing him again, and I told him that protecting him was never a sacrifice. It was the most natural thing in the world. Chloe smiled and said she was proud of both of us. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that the hardest chapter was truly behind us. Ethan's next chemotherapy session was the easiest one yet. He still felt tired afterward, but the nausea was manageable and his recovery was quicker. Dr. Harris stopped by his chair and commented on how well he was tolerating the treatment. She said she had seen patients struggle physically when their lives were filled with conflict, and thrive when that conflict was removed. She said Ethan was a clear example of that shift. I felt a surge of gratitude for every decision that led us here. At home life settled into a gentle rhythm. Movie nights on Fridays, slow breakfasts on Sundays. Chloe making pancakes while Ethan set the table and I brewed coffee. These moments were not flashy or dramatic, but they were precious. They represented a life rebuilt on care instead of control, respect instead of resentment. The house felt warm and alive, no longer haunted by tension or fear. David came by for dinner one evening and commented on how different everything felt. He said Ethan looked stronger and more confident, and that I seemed like myself again, not the exhausted version he had worried about months earlier. He admitted he had been concerned watching Mark's behavior but did not know how to intervene without overstepping. Now he said he was glad he had been able to help when it mattered. Ethan thanked him sincerely, and David simply said that family shows up when it counts. As the months passed, Ethan continued attending his support group, drawing inspiration from others who had reached remission and rebuilt their lives. He talked about traveling someday, about working again, about the simple freedom of planning beyond the next appointment. I listened without rushing him, letting hope unfold at its own pace, because we both understood how fragile and precious it was. One quiet afternoon I realized something that surprised me. I had not thought about Mark in weeks. Not with anger, not with fear, not even with curiosity. His absence had become complete, not because I forced it, but because my life no longer made room for him. That realization felt like closure in its purest form. Laura eventually reduced her visits as Ethan became more stable. On her last regular check, she hugged him gently and told him how proud she was of his progress. She said she had seen many patients, but those who fought in supportive environments always stood out. Ethan thanked her and said her presence had helped more than she knew. Watching that exchange reminded me how many people had carried us through this journey with kindness instead of cruelty. As spring approached, we planted that small garden we had talked about. Nothing ambitious, just herbs and a few vegetables. Ethan worked slowly, resting often, but he insisted on helping, getting his hands in the soil. Watching something grow felt symbolic in a way words could not capture. Chloe joked about our lack of gardening skills, and we laughed together under the open sky. One evening we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, the air cool and calm. Ethan wrapped in a blanket, Chloe beside him. He turned to me and said he finally felt safe again, not just physically, but emotionally. Those words settled deep in my chest, because safety was what he had been denied for so long, and what we had fought to reclaim. I told him that this house would always be his refuge, no matter what the future held. That promise had been made long before Mark entered our lives, and it would stand long after he was gone. Ethan nodded and leaned back, content. And in that moment, I knew that choosing compassion over cruelty had not just protected my son, it had given us both a future. Our family looked different now, smaller perhaps, but stronger, built on mutual care and respect instead of obligation and fear. Cancer was still part of our story, but it no longer defined every chapter. We faced the road ahead together with hope instead of dread, and that hope was something no one could ever take away again.